Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us here today. My name is Alex Sautke. I'm with FHIR, and I will be your moderator for today's session. Our next talk is about generating and exposing Swagger/OpenAPI definitions for FHIR, presented by Bruno and Lee. If you have any questions during the presentation, please use the Hoover app and post your questions over there, and we will get back to you after the presentation. And with that, I would say we get started. Over to you, Lee and Bruno.
All right. Thanks, Alexander. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Bruno Neves. I'm an integration specialist at IBM. Along with me, we have Lee, Surprenant. Lee is, Lee, who are you? Go ahead.
Sure. Thanks. Yeah, I work on the IBM FHIR Server. I'm a developer with IBM Watson Health, and Bruno and I have been working in this space for the last year or two together. So Bruno works as an integration specialist with our API Connect and API middleware technology, and then I work kind of more from a FHIR background within the FHIR community and on our FHIR Server implementation.
So that's who you are. We are. So today, as Alexander introduced, we are here to talk about one way you have to generate OpenAPI definitions, Swagger definitions. We'll be discussing, oops, hold on, it's not progressing. Yeah, we'll be comparing why we do that. We'll be comparing implementation guides, the FHIR spec versus an API developer portal and why that's important. How to configure and use the fhir-swagger-generator module from our open source software, our FHIR Server project, and then towards the end of the presentation, we'll be showing you how you can use those definitions created by the Swagger generator to expose into a developer portal. Okay. The session will pretty much be divided in two, right? So the first part of the session should take, I don't know, 15 minutes or so, just the slides, about 10 slides, not much. And then the second part of the session, another 15 minutes or so with a live demo, right? So we'll be downloading the tool, executing the tool, showing all the Swagger files that were generated, and then publishing all the way to the developer portal, moving on to the browser, and showing everything up there. So the first thing that comes to mind, right? So why exactly would I need a developer portal? And if you're not familiar with the developer portal, I'm sure that API or application developers that interact with public APIs are familiar with developer portal, because that's where they go to learn more about the APIs that an organization is exposing, right? So they will find some documentation, be able to register their application, test the API live in the developer portal. So it's sort of the industry standard when it comes down to finding the API documentation, API interfaces in order to interact with an organization's systems. Now, there is an overlap here, right? And that's the implementation guide, because the implementation guide, in a way, can do the same, right? It has a lot of the documentation for everyone that wants to interact with an API or a use case. But the documentation is very rich, And it applies to everyone, right? So it doesn't matter if you are an API provider, so you are the one, your organization is the one creating the API to expose to consumers, or if you're a consumer, right? So if you're a consumer, the information you need to consume is actually different than the information you need to provide. So I think that the implementation guide doesn't necessarily make that distinction and while the API developer, while it is exposed by the API provider, it is dedicated for the consumer, right? The consumer is the most important piece in the API model here. And so on the left, we had the implementation guide, and here is a representation on the right of the developer portal, right? So this is, since we work for IBM, the IBM tool, the IBM tooling is what we have access. So this is a representation of the developer portal using IBM API Connect. That's our API management platform. So expanding a little on the benefits, right? So as I said, it is the API developer portal is the industry standard for API exposure, right? If you are an application developer, trying to interact, say, with an organization that's exposing, financial data, right? So go to American Express, they have a developer portal. You would learn all about their APIs there. You would register for an application, subscribe to a consumption plan, and then you will be able to, interact with that API. Now, if you want to interact with a retail API, you would go to another a big retailer out there, go to their developer portal and have the same experience. So again, that's the industry standard. And I think that for the healthcare organizations, the experience for some of them is already the same, but we don't talk much about ways that we are going to be exposing those APIs, right? We talk about exposing the FHIR APIs, but we don't necessarily talk about how and where and what the experience should be for the application developer, from the onboarding, getting started perspective. So I think the developer portal is here to help on that. Again, the application developers will use it to learn about APIs a provider is exposing, right? So the developer portal can have all of the APIs documentation included in its own website. It could have references to external documentation. Now, some of developer portals will have sample requests, sample responses, sample code, right? So if you're a Java application developer, you may want to know how to code to interact with that API, right? So the developer portal can automatically build that piece of code for you, so you can just copy and paste to your actual application. It simplifies onboarding, right? Because again, you can go to the developer portal, which is, in general are all publicly exposed. So you go to your browser, type the developer portal URL. You have ways to sign up for a user. Once you have a user, you can create an application. So you get the application credentials, client ID, client secret, without talking to anyone, right? So in a matter of a couple minutes, you can start interacting with API without waiting for approvals, although it's debatable, right? For some APIs, I think you want somebody to be approving access, while for other APIs, it may be okay that they are fully open, right? Again, but it simplifies onboarding. That's the point. We already talked about documentation, sample code, request, responses, payload, samples. They're all there. And some developer portals also allow you to try the API, right? So you don't necessarily have to write code in order to interact with the API. usually there will be like a try it tab in the developer portal, and then you can, do a couple gets, see the response, see if the response contains all the fields, all the information that your application needs to do what you want it to do, right? But to be able to do that, it is only possible if you have an OpenAPI definition or a Swagger definition in your hands, because that's the main artifact that a developer portal has to have, right, in order to expose the documentation, those samples, the message models, that's the paper that defines how the interface of that API, and to get that OpenAPI definition, we have options, right? We can create the OpenAPI definition from scratch, manually writing the YAMLs manually, and that's fine for some APIs. But for more complex APIs, like that rely on more complex message models, like the FHIR APIs, creating those by hand from scratch, it would be a lot of work, right? So we needed something that would help us here to automate at least that part of the job. And to talk more details about that, Lee is one of the maintainers of the Swagger generator, the FHIR Swagger generator. So he can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, thanks, Bruno.
Yeah.
So again, I'm a developer on the IBM FHIR Server, and a common request for us is clients would want to put this behind some existing API management. So if they have an existing API Connect instance from IBM or an existing 3-scale or what have you, right? They want to use that with the FHIR Server behind it. Or even in some new clients where maybe they don't yet have that infrastructure, they'd like the idea of a developer portal, and they want to have an API management in front of the FHIR Server. Since Bruno said a lot of those tools work with Swagger, we developed this fairly simple. I put simple in quotes because it's not that simple, but it's just a couple classes generator that will take us from the structure definitions into a Swagger. And to do this, we actually end up cheating a little bit in the sense that we already generate a Java-based model from the structure definitions. And so the approach of our generator right now is actually to kind of reflect over our model and represent that model in Swagger. And so it's kind of structure definition to Java and then to Swagger. Next slide. So here's kind of a high-level list of some considerations if you're trying to go from the FHIR to Swagger. I still say Swagger out of habit, but I'm going to try to start saying OpenAPI. It switched from Swagger to OpenAPI in like version 2.0. So if you're trying to generate OpenAPI from Swagger, here's some considerations. The first one is what I would call integrated schema. I don't know if it's the right term, but integrated schema versus external docs. So Swagger definitions typically will have the schema definition included inside of the OpenAPI. And so this works for simple APIs, but for other ones like FHIR, it can be hit or miss. And what's sort of interesting is it's most people think of what's inside of those Swagger definition, OpenAPI definitions as being JSON schema, but it's not exactly JSON schema because JSON schema I don't think has really finalized. And so it's kind of like, depending which version you're on, it's kind of mostly like JSON schema, but those details end up mattering for complex schemas like FHIR. And so this is part of the reason that there's not just like a, everyone has this one OpenAPI definition from FHIR, right? Everyone kind of has their own approach for doing this currently. And hopefully eventually, as a community will, congeal around, here's a set of OpenAPI specs. Oh, Bruno, there you go.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
That's fine. So the external schema definition is like the way to punt on this. So if you do not want to try representing this complicated schema inside of the exact set of JSON schema that's in OpenAPI, you can, instead of representing the schema within the definition, just have an external docs reference that points out to an implementation guide. For people that are familiar with FHIR, I actually think that that's a better approach because I have not found a way. I don't think it's really possible to represent FHIR perfectly in the OpenAPI schema. And so you always make some simplifying assumptions, or you do some edits, and that's sort of what we've done. So if your goal is to target this FHIR API at developers that may not be familiar with FHIR, you can get some benefit out of having kind of a simplified view of the FHIR through JSON schema embedded inside of the OpenAPI. And so that's the approach that we took in our generator. The next consideration I have here is OpenAPI per resource type or all-in-one. Our generator actually supports both of these. We package with our server like the all-in-one, so you get like a kind of generic Swagger UI view. And you can see all the different operations that you can perform against all the resources. When we started working with Bruno, and he'll show this as part of his demo in a little bit, API management, some API management tools will let you kind of mix and match APIs into products. And we realized that we might be able to have some nice utility here of kind of mixing and matching different resource types into different products. And so an example of this is like if you're trying to implement the CMS regulations, there's a patient access API, which involves read access to specific resource types, and maybe like 3 different implementation guides all combined into this one API. But then separately, there's a provider directory API, which interacts with some of the same resource types, but not all of the same, slightly different search parameter definitions. And so here, you might be able to take the same endpoints, the same, for example, organization endpoint, and kind of mix and match it into different access plans. And Bruno will show that in a little bit. And so we'll generate the all-in-one, but also kind of a more streamlined OpenAPI per resource type. And then the last piece here is kind of a key one. I mentioned our generator is like going from the structure definitions into Java code and then into a Swagger. But the an approach I've seen others take, and I think might be better in the long run, is starting from capability statements. So as a kind of generic FHIR server implementer, we're an open source, we implement the entire spec. Our approach made sense for us, but a lot of FHIR implementations start with a capability. You start with an implementation guide or a capability statement. You don't want to support everything in FHIR. You just want to say you support this thing that's required of you. And so there are tools that exist in this space. So if you work on these tools or have experience with them, please share in the session Q&A or chat, because we'd love to converse with you about it. Eventually, I'd like to kind of update our stuff so that we can generate from a capability statement and not just from our Java model. Next slide. Okay, so here's some of the simplifying assumptions I mentioned earlier in terms of representing the FHIR inside of OpenAPI. So the first one, I guess, isn't much of a simplifying assumption. It's just a choice we made. So in the FHIR spec, there's kind of these code elements. They have required bindings, and instead of kind of representing those in the FHIR idioms, we just kind of map those into string enums so they're easier for people to consume, which sort of leads us into this next bullet, which is about extensions on primitive types. So in FHIR, you can have a string type that has kind of no value and has just an extension instead. A common reason for that is maybe if you have like a data absent reason. So it would be like it's supposed to be integer, but instead of an integer, we're going to just put this extension on it. These primitive extensions, I don't think are real common. So if you look at some other places in the community, there's some precedent for kind of at least providing a view that doesn't have these. And it like blows out the schema. It doubles the schema size for each of these leaf nodes. You'd have a parallel array in some cases if it's a repeating field, and it gets pretty messy. So we chose just to not include those primitive extensions in our JSON schema. Our server still supports it behind the covers, so you can send them. But when you're first looking at it, or when you're looking at examples, you won't see those. In FHIR, there's such thing as contained resource. So any resource can contain any other type of resource. It's kind of like making a not, it's like embedding it in the context of a different resource. That, especially if you're trying to generate one OpenAPI definition per resource type, this doesn't work real well because every resource type endpoint has to include every other resource type in the entire schema. And so you end up with the full schema of FHIR for every endpoint type. Here we took some liberty, and we just made this kind of extensible. You can put anything you want under contained. We don't put that in our schema. And then the last thing we have here is wildcard choice types. So a choice type in FHIR is, an example of this would be like the patient deceased. It could be like a Boolean, or it could be a date time. So it could be a deceased Boolean or a deceased date time. And either one is valid in FHIR. But there's other things like an extension has a value. So an extension value is a choice type that can be of type any. And so there's like 63 different things that it could be. And of those, there's like 6 to 10 that are actually used. And then there's like 53 that are pretty much not real common. And a couple of those are just like very abstract types that don't make a whole lot of sense. And so the approach we took in our generator is we're not even going to kind of mention all of the choice types that are allowed, just the ones that we would expect to actually see. And so these are some of our simplifying assumptions. I'd definitely be interested in other people that have done this work. What kind of assumptions have you made? So leave it in the chat or the Q&A, or maybe we'll have time at the end to discuss. Next slide. Oh yeah, this is my biggest tip, I think, is if you're doing this, make sure you include examples in your generated OpenAPI. So both request response examples, but also within the definitions themselves. Including examples will allow a lot of tools, maybe not all tools, but it'll allow a lot of tools to just display those instead of trying to auto-generate their own, because the FHIR schema is recursive and also has circular dependencies, and you have to kind of either break those dependencies in your schema, or sometimes if you can provide examples, the tools will just show those examples instead of trying to auto-generate them. Okay, next slide. All right, and we can blow through this pretty quick, Bruno. This is just kind of the summary of what we've done. We've taken these various artifacts from the conformance package, like the structure definitions, but also like the terminology stuff, like the code systems or value sets. And we're going to try to generate a kind of more consumable Swagger that more developers are familiar with. You can open that up with kind of standard Swagger tools in that case, or you can import it into an API Connect or API management tool. I think that's it. I'll hand it back to you, Bruno, for a demo.
All right. Thanks, Lee, for going through the details of the generator. Like you, I also tend to say Swagger, but yeah, more and more people are saying Open API definitions because of the new name these days. So I'll try to stick with that as well. So it's part of the live demo, right? So to do this live demo, I will need my my terminal and some commands. So here's my terminal. All right, so the first thing I want to do here, well, let me go back, and hopefully I won't regret doing this. I want to delete everything and start from scratch. All right, so to make all of this happen, I kind of have a script here. So I will create a directory based on a version in a variable that I already defined, and I will download the generator, right, from our GitHub page. So these are the commands I run. It's now downloading. It takes about 7-8 seconds. 5. It's early morning. So now I have the generator. Like, it's a jar file, very easy to consume. To execute the generator, of course, there are multiple ways to execute. In the resources slide, there is a link to the documentation explaining the different ways you can execute this Java file, right? So in this case, what I do here is just a simple command to generate all those Swagger OpenAPI definitions for me. It takes a few seconds, as you can see. What it's doing, it is generating with this configuration an OpenAPI definition for every single FHIR resource out there. So about 140 plus files. So if I do, it creates a folder for me actually. So I need to go to that folder. If I do an ls here, hopefully it's not too small. Let me know if people are saying it's too small in the comments. I don't have a view of that, and I can make it bigger. So these are all the files generated, all the OpenAPI definitions generated by that command. Now, the next thing I want to do here, I want to, inside of an OpenAPI definition, there could be references to the backend, right? Because the idea here is to take this a number of these definitions and expose in the developer portal. But it's also a good idea to expose the same definition in an API gateway, right? Because you don't necessarily want people to hit your FHIR server without any security checks or without protecting your FHIR server, right? A FHIR server is supposed to be a backend server, internal server, and now you're talking about exposing endpoints to the public, right? To the external community. So you want ways to secure that server. So it's common for API management definitions to have an API management tools to have API gateway. So I'll be doing that as well. I'll be publishing this to an API gateway. So once the request comes in, the API call comes in, and it hits the API gateway needs to know where to go, right? So I have one command here that's replacing, the standard endpoint information that's inside of the OpenAPI definition with my actual backend server, which is also in a variable that I defined previous to this call. So I'll be doing that. I'm also doing some massage on the definitions here because, as Lee mentioned, this is an OpenAPI generator, right? So an OpenAPI generator is not only supposed to work with IBM tooling, right? It works with our IBM API management tool, but it can also work with others out there. And in this case, I have to add a couple fields that are required for the IBM tooling to work properly. So that's what I did with those commands as well. And at this point, I want to create like a collection of APIs, right? Because as Lee mentioned, on the CMS rules, right, here in US, everybody's talking about the patient access API and the provider directory API. So those are not really one like single APIs, right? They are use cases, and each of those, oops, let me move those around. Those are use cases, and each of those use cases are composed by multiple APIs. So I think that the provider directory API has about 10, 12 different APIs. They are all here that you may need to use. And the patient access API, right? This one use case, we'll have about 25, right? So I want to create a collection of those APIs, or two collections for those two use cases, so that when application developers try to consume those products, that's what we call, they don't have to subscribe to 25, 40 different APIs. They subscribe to one product, to one plan, and they get access to all those APIs that they will be looking to use, right? So to create those, I have these commands: API create product. And I also have some custom plans that I defined in a separate file. So that's what I'm doing there. Not here, here. So I will execute those commands to create my products, those collection of APIs. So they are done now. And what time? Okay, 31 minutes in. Have another 14 left. All right, so once I do that, I'm ready to publish, right? I'm ready to publish those APIs, those products to the developer portal and to the API gateway that's protecting my FHIR server. So to be able to publish, of course, I need to log in. So I'll do that. I'll log into my API management platform. So I'm in. And now I can publish them, right? So we show a couple commands here to initiate the publish. And now it's doing its work, right? Sending data to the manager server where everything gets stored. Let me move things around here a little bit. So as you can see, the provider directory API has already been published. So at this point, I can move to the not here. Yeah, not here. Sorry, I was wrong. I was working at the wrong workspace. This is the one. So this is the developer portal, right? So the APIs, those products were pushed to the manager server, which is the brains of the operations here. You know, the developer portal has access to that database, so now it can expose those APIs over here. So this is the developer portal. That's the application developer entry point. The application developer can create an account, can sign in, can create their applications, get their client ID, client secrets, all that good stuff, right? But to explore the documentation, so I go to API products, you know, starting with the provider directory API use case. I click on it, I see all the APIs that compose that use case. So I can now subscribe to those APIs, or to the plans, better saying. And just to exemplify something that's very common that, you know, our clients do, I created two plans, right? One external access plan and one internal access plan, which is, as you can see, this one is more controlled. And the reason why this one is more controlled is if I want to expand this organization API resource as an example, right? The external access plan gives access to only the GET operations, right? So essentially it's a read-only plan. It's open for everyone, doesn't require approval or anything. And it's also limited to 100 calls per hour. So if you try to send more than 100 calls per hour, you start seeing you know, some error messages. Though I think it's 429. That's the HPR code. When you exceed the limit, then you have to wait till the next hour to try again. And the internal access plan, you would expect that internal applications may be modifying data inside of the FHIR server. So you are allowing them to subscribe to this plan and get access to post, put, delete operations as well. Now, let me go back to the other product that I have, the patient access. So the patient access product, again, it's a more complex one, right? It's composed by 25 different APIs, and same thing, right? You can subscribe to different plans, or you can look into more details about the API, right? So as you can see here, the developer portal tries to validate the OpenAPI definition. OpenAPI definitions generated out of the FHIR spec are not that simple. So the developer portal tries to protect the browser, not to necessarily validate it unless I want to validate. So it shows me a warning saying that if you don't want that to show up in your developer portal, you can simply disable in the configuration. So I'll just go ahead and close it. And it has the documentation that my definition had, right? So my definition in this case is has details about the endpoint. If I select one of the operations, I have some information about how to do a get, right? What's the endpoint to use? What are the query params that are available for me to use, right? So everything is documented here automatically. I didn't have to do anything really. I also get, since it's a get, I only have, there is no body request, right? Only a response sample. So it generates a sample of the response I should expect. Remember I mentioned code. It generates code for me. So if I'm a Java developer, now I can, look into, I can copy this code somewhere and do my application and interact with this API. So if I'm a Node developer, it's the same thing, right? How do I interact with the API? So it kind of tries to accelerate the onboarding or the experience of the application developer. And I can also try an API from the developer portal, right? So if I hit send over here, now it's going to the API gateway. API gateway is doing its security checks, which in this case is none, because it's just a demo. It's not a production system. And it goes to the FHIR server, right? So this is the result from the FHIR server. We have over 32,000 patients on this server. So I'm trying to find the first one here. So if I get this ID of a patient and I want to interact with another API, maybe if I go to the condition API, where is it? I forgot to order by alphabetic order. All right, so if I want to get a condition using subject, I will use that patient ID to see the conditions of that given patient. I hit send. Then I get this message back, which is a list of conditions for that patient ID, like 9. So it gives the idea, right? Once you start exposing those APIs to the public, you may want to have something like this in order to facilitate onboarding, easy access to documentation, allow them to quickly test your APIs, manage their access essentially. There are many benefits of an API management platform that you may want to consider. But I think that's it. That's what I had to show. So if I go back to my to the deck, right? Let me move stuff around. Okay, here you go. That was the live demo. The goals, again, just to recap. the value of the Swagger generator, right? Not creating those API definitions by hand. Again, each API definitions could have over 3,000-4,000 lines of configuration. So don't do it by hand. Use the Swagger generator. Test it. Give us your feedback, please. How to test drive APIs, the value of the developer portal. We talked about that throughout the whole presentation, right? Has the contact information if you want to reach out to us. Resources, the links to the things that we talked about. Q&A. And before I go to Q&A, there are other slides here with the screenshots with everything that I did. It will be made available to everyone. The commands I typed or copied and pasted, they are all here in the deck as well, if you want to expect them later. But yeah, I guess it leaves us with 5 minutes for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Bruno and Lee. So let me switch over to Hoover. I see one unanswered question. Are you also thinking about generating API guides from IGs?
Yeah, I can take that one. So implementation guides are definitely key in the FHIR space right now. When I mentioned that, I think generating OpenAPI from capability statements would be a good approach, but one that we haven't taken on our generator yet. That's mostly what I was referring to. So typically an implementation guide will have a capability statement for the server side, and it'll say, here's all the things that the server should do or has to do to to meet the needs of this particular implementation guide, or for this particular use case that this guide was developed for. And so I think from those capability statements, you'd probably be generating the Swagger. Now, there may be other things in an implementation guide that you could use that I haven't considered or thought of yet, but I think yes, the idea would be eventually to generate the Swagger from capability statements. And there may be tools that already do that. I haven't been exposed to them, at least ones that I haven't seen ones that do it in a way similar to how we're generating with a simplified schema.
Okay. Do we directly have the questions from the audience here? If yes, you can simply go ahead and unmute yourself and ask the question directly.
Yeah, I guess that was really the question that I'd had. It's Brian from Telstra Health down under in Australia. And yeah, so I was just comparing it. Have you tried out the IG Builders Swagger generator or OpenAPI Generation, which does it from the capability statement in an IG?
Yeah, I haven't looked at it in a while. I have looked at what I believe it produces from particular implementation guides. And I tried answering this in the Q&A too, is I think if you look at the PlanNet one, so that's one I've looked at recently.
Yeah.
That implementation guide ships an OpenAPI specification. That OpenAPI specification is very nice. It documents the full REST API, all the interactions. It's very useful. When it comes down to representing the schema for the FHIR objects, it has an external docs reference that points at the implementation guide, because that's the only way to properly represent what FHIR is really capable of. All the details is you just point at the FHIR spec.
Yeah.
And our approach.
So I've done a custom.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I did a custom process after that's done, which actually takes it and then cleans out all the schema to what it actually needs. So
Interesting.
Unfortunately, I'm on the .NET stack, so it's not quite the same as what you guys are doing, but the approach might be worthwhile.
Yeah, is that an open source tool that you have, or is this something?
Yep, I can drop it in the chat. It does it.
Yeah, please.
I'm doing a lot of IGs and stuff, but yeah, I'll share
Yeah,
the
I'd
link.
definitely be interested. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Again, thank you so much. And yeah, have a great day at DevDays.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.